The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Prince William made his way toward the main entrance. He had just returned from a charity event in Scotland, tired but satisfied with the progress they had made. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he approached the grand doorway where two royal guards stood at attention, their red uniforms pristine and their faces expressionless beneath their iconic bearskin hats. William had always respected the dedication of the royal guards. These men and women stood for hours in all weather conditions, maintaining the dignity and tradition of the British monarchy. He often wondered how they managed to remain so still, so focused, despite the endless stream of tourists taking photographs and sometimes trying to make them laugh or react. On this particular morning, something seemed different. As William walked closer, he noticed one of the guards shifting his weight slightly, his eyes darting toward his phone that he had partially concealed behind his back. The prince slowed his pace, observing the situation more carefully. The guard appeared to be texting someone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen while trying to maintain his rigid posture. William felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He understood that these were long shifts, that boredom could set in, but the rules were clear. Royal guards were expected to maintain absolute discipline while on duty. No phones, no distractions, no breaks in protocol. The tradition had been upheld for centuries, and it was part of what made the British Royal Guard so respected around the world. He approached the entrance, and the guard quickly tried to slip his phone back into his pocket, but it was too late. William had seen everything. He stopped directly in front of the young man, whose face had turned pale beneath his tall bearskin hat. The guard's name tag read Thompson, and he couldn't have been more than 25 years old. "Good morning," William said, his voice calm but firm. The guard stood even straighter, if that was possible, his eyes fixed forward as protocol demanded. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson responded, his voice tight with nervousness. William glanced at the pocket where the phone had disappeared. "May I see your phone, please?" Thompson hesitated for just a moment before retrieving the device and handing it over. His hand trembled slightly as William took it and glanced at the screen. The messages were innocent enough, just conversations with what appeared to be family members and friends. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he had violated one of the most fundamental rules of his position. "How long have you been serving as a royal guard?" William asked, still holding the phone.
"Oh,
3 years?" Sir Thompson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And in those 3 years, you've been trained extensively on the protocols and expectations of this role, correct?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness." William looked at the young man's face, noting the beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He could see the fear in Thompson's eyes, the realization that his career might be ending right there in the courtyard. Part of William felt sympathy for him. Everyone made mistakes. Everyone had moments of weakness. But another part of him, the part that understood the weight of duty and tradition, knew that standards had to be maintained. "I'm disappointed," William said quietly, so only Thompson could hear. "You represent something larger than yourself when you put on this uniform. Every tourist who walks by, every citizen of this country, looks at you and sees the strength and dignity of our monarchy. What do you think they see when they catch you on your phone?" Thompson's jaw clenched, and William could see him fighting back emotion. "I understand, sir. There's no excuse for my behavior." William nodded slowly, appreciating the honesty. He looked around the courtyard, noticing that several staff members had paused in their duties, sensing that something significant was happening. The other guard remained perfectly still, though William suspected he was acutely aware of every word being spoken. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave your post immediately," William said, his voice carrying a tone of finality. "Your commanding officer will be notified, and there will be a formal disciplinary hearing." Thompson's face crumbled for just a moment before he regained his composure. "I understand, Your Royal Highness. I apologize for letting you down, for letting everyone down." Ow. William handed back the phone and watched as Thompson removed his bearskin hat, tucked it under his arm, and walked away from his post with as much dignity as he could muster. The young man's shoulders were slumped, and William could see the weight of shame and disappointment in every step he took as Thompson disappeared into the building. William felt the eyes of everyone in the courtyard upon him. He had just dismissed a royal guard on the spot, something that rarely happened and would certainly become the subject of palace gossip within minutes. He wondered if he had been too harsh, too quick to act. But the rules existed for a reason, and if he made an exception for one person, where would it end? He continued into the palace, his mind still on the interaction. Catherine was waiting for him in their private quarters, and he knew she would want to hear about his trip to Scotland. But as he walked through the familiar corridors, he couldn't shake the image of Thompson's face, the young man's career potentially in ruins because of a moment of carelessness. Later that afternoon, William was in his office reviewing documents when his private secretary, James Thornton, knocked on the door. James was a seasoned professional who had served the royal family for over 20 years, and his expression was serious as he entered. "Your Royal Highness, I need to speak with you about the incident this morning with Guard Thompson," James said. Closing the door behind him, William set down his pen and gestured for James to sit. "Yes, I expected this conversation. What's the situation?" James settled into the chair across from William's desk, his folder clutched in his hands. "Well, sir, the story has spread rather quickly through the staff. That's not surprising, given the visibility of what happened. However, there's something you should know about Thompson." William leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on. Thompson has been one of our most dedicated guards for the past 3 years. His record is spotless, not a single mark against him until today. In fact, he's received several commendations for his service." "I see," William said, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. "But that doesn't change what happened this morning. He was using his phone while on duty. Of course, sir, I'm not suggesting he should face no consequences. However, I thought you should know the full context before the disciplinary hearing." James opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Thompson's mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer 2 weeks ago. She's been in and out of the hospital, and according to his commanding officer, he's been under tremendous stress. William felt his chest tighten. He took the paper from James and read through the details. Thompson had requested emergency leave several times in recent weeks, but due to staffing shortages, only some of his requests had been granted. He had been texting his sister that morning, coordinating his mother's care and trying to arrange transportation to the hospital for his next scheduled visit. "Why wasn't I told about this before?" William asked, though he knew the answer. There were hundreds of staff members, each with their own personal struggles and challenges. It was impossible to know every detail of every person's life. "Thompson is quite private, sir. He didn't want special treatment or sympathy. He's been trying to balance his duties with his family obligations without complaint. This morning was simply a moment when the pressure became too much." William stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace grounds. He could see tourists gathering near the gates, cameras ready to capture photos of the guards. The image of Thompson walking away from his post played over and over in his mind, but now it was colored with new information, new understanding. "I made a mistake," William said quietly, more to himself than to James. James remained silent, allowing William to process the information. After a long moment, the prince turned back to face his secretary. "I need to speak with Thompson personally. Can you arrange that?" "Of course, Your Royal Highness. He's currently in the staff quarters, waiting to hear about his disciplinary hearing. I can have him brought to your office within the hour." "No," William said, shaking his head. "That would be too formal, too intimidating after what happened this morning. I'll go to him. It's the least I can do." James looked surprised but nodded. "Very well, sir. I'll let him know you're coming." 20 minutes later, William found himself walking through the staff quarters, an area of the palace he didn't visit often. The corridors were narrower here, the decoration more modest, but still dignified. He passed several staff members who looked startled to see him, quickly stepping aside and bowing or curtsying as he passed. James led him to a small room where Thompson sat on a simple wooden chair, still in his uniform but without the distinctive bearskin hat. The young man stood immediately when William entered, his face a mixture of surprise and anxiety. "Your Royal Highness, I wasn't expecting," Thompson began, but William raised a hand to stop him. "Please sit down," William said gently. "I'm the one who should be apologizing for the unexpected visit." Thompson sat slowly, his posture still rigid with military discipline. William pulled another chair closer and sat down as well, wanting to eliminate the physical distance between them. James quietly excused himself, closing the door to give them privacy. "I've learned about your mother," William began, his voice soft with genuine concern. "I wish I had known this morning. It would have changed how I handled the situation." Thompson's eyes glistened with emotion, but he kept his voice steady. "With respect, sir, it shouldn't have mattered. I broke protocol. I knew the rules and I violated them. My personal situation doesn't excuse that." William was impressed by the young man's integrity, even in the face of compassion. "You're right that rules exist for important reasons, but context matters too. We're all human, Thompson. We all have moments when life becomes overwhelming." "I've never done anything like that before," Thompson said, his voice cracking slightly. "In 3 years, I've never once compromised my duties. But this morning, I got a message from my sister saying Mom had taken a turn for the worse. She was asking if I could come to the hospital. I was just trying to respond to let her know I'd be there as soon as my shift ended." William nodded, feeling the weight of his earlier decision pressing down on him. He thought about his own mother, Princess Diana, and how devastating it had been to lose her. He couldn't imagine having to stand at attention, unable to respond, while receiving news that she was suffering. "Tell me about your mother," William said. "What's her name?" Thompson looked surprised by the question. "Margaret, sir. Margaret Thompson. She was a nurse for 35 years before she retired. She's the reason I wanted to serve. She always talked about duty and helping others." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," William said sincerely. "And she raised a son who clearly inherited her values. The fact that you're sitting here taking full responsibility, even when you have every reason to ask for understanding, speaks volumes about your character." "Thank you, sir, but I still let everyone down. I let the crown down." William was quiet for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "When I saw you on your phone this morning, I reacted as a prince. As someone responsible for upholding tradition and standards. I didn't react as a man, as someone who understands that life sometimes demands our attention at inconvenient moments. I should have asked questions before making a judgment." Thompson shook his head. "You had every right to dismiss me, Your Royal Highness. Any commanding officer would have done the same." Perhaps William agreed. But a good leader also knows when to show mercy, when to understand that strict adherence to rules without consideration of circumstances can sometimes do more harm than good. He stood up and walked to the small window in the room. Looking out at the palace grounds, "My grandmother, the Queen, once told me that the strength of the monarchy doesn't come from being perfect or unyielding. It comes from being fair and showing wisdom in difficult situations. I wasn't wise this morning. I was rigid and quick to judge." Thompson remained silent, clearly unsure how to respond. William turned back to face him, his decision made. "I'm not going to move forward with the disciplinary hearing," William said firmly. "Instead, I'm going to grant you immediate emergency leave. 2 weeks, with full pay, to be with your mother and your family. When you return, if you choose to return, you'll resume your post with no mark on your record." Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, I don't understand. I broke protocol. Everyone saw it. If you just let me return without consequences, it could undermine discipline across the entire guard." "Let me worry about that," William said. "As for everyone who saw what happened this morning, they'll soon see something more important. They'll see that the royal family understands compassion and knows how to admit when we've made a mistake." "I don't know what to say," Thompson whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough, and don't say anything. Just go be with your mother. Hold her hand. Tell her about this conversation if it will make her smile. And when she's recovered, or when you're ready, come back and continue being the exemplary guard I've now learned you've always been." William extended his hand, and Thompson stood quickly to shake it. The young man's grip was firm despite the trembling in his fingers. As William left the room, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had corrected his mistake, shown mercy where it was deserved, and hopefully demonstrated the kind of leadership his grandmother tried to instill in him. But as he walked back through the corridors toward his office, he realized that the story was far from over. By dinner time that evening, word of his decision had spread throughout the palace staff and beyond. The palace press office was already receiving calls from journalists who had somehow learned about the morning's incident and were eager to know more. Catherine found him in his study that evening, his head in his hands as he reviewed the messages that had been piling up throughout the day. She sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I heard what happened," she said gently. "With the guard this morning." William looked up at her, seeing understanding in her eyes. "I handled it poorly at first. I was too quick to judge, too focused on the rules without considering the person behind the uniform." "But you fixed it," Catherine pointed out. "You listened, you learned the full story, and you made the right decision. That's what good leadership looks like." "The press is going to have a field day with this," William said, rubbing his temples. "Prince William shows weakness. Prince William can't maintain discipline. Prince William makes exceptions to centuries-old protocols." Catherine shook her head. "Or Prince William shows compassion. Prince William understands that rules serve people, not the other way around. Prince William demonstrates that the monarchy can evolve and show mercy while still maintaining dignity and tradition." William wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there would be consequences he hadn't yet anticipated. The royal family operated under constant scrutiny, and every decision, every action was analyzed and criticized by media outlets around the world. By reversing his decision and showing mercy to Thompson, had he opened himself up to accusations of being soft, of not taking his responsibilities seriously? His phone buzzed with another message, this one from his father's office requesting a meeting the following morning. William closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The embarrassment he had feared was beginning to materialize, but not in the way he had expected. It wasn't Thompson who would bring shame to the court, but rather William's own decision to show compassion might be seen as a weakness by those who valued tradition above all else. As night fell over Kensington Palace, William sat alone in his study, wondering if he had made the right choice. The weight of the crown, even though he hadn't yet worn it officially, pressed down on him with increasing intensity. The next morning arrived too quickly for William's liking. He had barely slept, his mind racing through various scenarios of how the meeting with his father might unfold. King Charles had always been particular about protocol and tradition, having waited decades to assume the throne. William knew his father would have opinions about how he had handled the situation with Thompson. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in one of the palace's private drawing rooms. William arrived 5 minutes early, a habit instilled in him from childhood. His father was already there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the gardens. "Good morning, Father," William said, his voice formal, despite the familiar relationship. Charles turned, his expression unreadable. "William, please sit down. We have much to discuss." They settled into 2 armchairs facing each other, and for a moment neither spoke. William braced himself for criticism, for a lecture about maintaining discipline and upholding the standards that had been in place for generations. "I heard about yesterday," Charles began, his tone measured. "The incident with the royal guard, sir. I'm sure you have concerns about how I handled it."
Oh.
"Concerns, perhaps. But first I'd like to hear your perspective. Walk me through what happened and why you made the decisions you did." William was surprised by the request, but grateful for the opportunity to explain. He recounted the entire story, from seeing Thompson with his phone to learning about his mother's illness to ultimately granting him leave with no disciplinary action. He tried to be honest about his initial reaction and his subsequent realization that he had been too harsh when he finished. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered everything he had heard. William waited, his heart pounding in his chest. "When I was your age," Charles finally said, "I made similar decisions that were questioned by those around me. I often felt torn between maintaining the traditions I was born into and acknowledging that the world was changing, that people's expectations and needs were evolving." William leaned forward slightly, surprised by his father's candid tone. "What did you do?" "Sometimes I held firm to tradition, and sometimes I innovated. Both choices had consequences, and both were criticized in different ways. Charles stood and walked back to the window. The challenge of leadership, particularly in our unique position, is finding the balance between being a symbol of continuity and being a relevant, compassionate human being. I'm worried that I showed weakness, William admitted. That by reversing my decision and showing mercy, I've undermined the authority that these positions require. Charles turned back to face him, and there was something new in his expression. Something William couldn't quite identify. Was it pride? Understanding? Do you know why the Royal Guards are so respected, William? It's not just because they follow rules without question. It's because they represent something larger than themselves. They represent dedication, sacrifice, and service. But for that service to mean anything, it must be in service to something worthy. I'm not sure I follow, William said. Though he was beginning to sense where his father was leading, a monarchy that demands perfect obedience without compassion is not worthy of that sacrifice, Charles explained. What you did yesterday, first in upholding the standard and then in showing mercy when you learned the full context. That's the kind of leadership this institution needs. You demonstrated both strength and wisdom. William felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tinged with confusion. But the press is already criticizing the decision. There are articles questioning whether I'm fit to maintain discipline and uphold tradition. The press will always criticize, Charles said with a slight smile. That's their role. But you and I both know that public opinion is complex. For every person who thinks you showed weakness, there will be another who sees compassion. For every traditionalist who questions your judgment, there will be a young person who feels the monarchy is finally becoming more human, more accessible. So you don't think I made a mistake? Charles returned to his chair and looked directly into his son's eyes. I think you made the only decision that honored both your duty and your humanity. That's not always easy to do, and you won't always get it right. But in this case, you did. The relief William felt was profound, but it was quickly followed by a new concern. What about the other guards? What about the message this sends to everyone else who serves in these roles? That's actually why I called this meeting, Charles said, his tone becoming more businesslike. We need to be proactive about this. The story is going to spread, and we need to control the narrative before it controls us. Over the next hour, they strategized together. They would release a statement acknowledging the incident and explaining the decision, emphasizing both the importance of protocol and the value of compassion and leadership. They would also announce a review of emergency leave policies for all royal staff and guards, ensuring that people facing family crises had better support systems in place. This could actually become a positive moment for us, Charles suggested. An opportunity to show that the monarchy can evolve without abandoning its core values. William nodded, feeling more confident about the path forward. I want to visit Thompson and his mother at the hospital. Not as a publicity stunt, but genuinely. If she's well enough to receive visitors, I'd like to meet her. Charles considered this for a moment. That's a generous gesture, but be careful. You don't want it to seem performative or like you're trying to manage the optics. I understand, but I genuinely want to meet the woman who raised such an honorable son. And I think Thompson deserves to know that this decision wasn't just about reversing a mistake. It was about recognizing the value of his service and his character. Then do it, Charles agreed. But do it quietly, without fanfare. The most powerful gestures are often the ones made away from cameras and headlines. As William left the meeting, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, there would be criticism. Yes, there would be those who questioned his judgment. But he had the support of his father, and more importantly, he knew in his heart that he had made the right choice. That afternoon, William made arrangements to visit the hospital. James Thornton helped coordinate with Thompson's family, ensuring that the visit would be welcome and that Margaret Thompson was well enough to receive guests. The visit was scheduled for the following day, minimal security and absolutely no press notification when the day arrived. William found himself in a modest hospital room in central London. Margaret Thompson was propped up in her bed, looking frail but alert. Her daughter sat beside her, and Thompson himself stood near the window, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the visit. Mrs. Thompson, William said warmly as he entered the room. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I hope I'm not intruding." Margaret's eyes lit up despite her obvious fatigue. "Your Royal Highness, this is an honor I never expected. Please come in. My son has told me what happened, what you did for him." William pulled up a chair beside her bed, and for the next 30 minutes they talked. Not about the incident or the decision, but about Margaret's life, her career as a nurse, her pride in her children. She told funny stories about Thompson as a boy, about his determination to serve his country from a young age. "He gets his sense of duty from you," William observed. That was clear even in the way he took responsibility for his actions. Margaret reached out and squeezed her son's hand. "I taught both my children that service means something. It means being there for others, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something." "That's exactly what your son has done," William said, "and it's what I failed to recognize initially. I'm grateful for the chance to correct that mistake." As he prepared to leave, Margaret called him back. "Your Royal Highness, may I say something?" "Of course. What you did, showing mercy to my boy, that took more courage than the alternative. Anyone can enforce rules without thinking. It takes real strength to question your own judgment and change course when you realize there's a better way." William felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means more than you know." As he left the hospital, William realized that this entire experience had taught him something crucial about leadership. It wasn't about being perfect or always making the right decision the first time. It was about being willing to listen, to learn, and to admit when you were wrong. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone, even when they wore uniforms and stood at attention. The following weeks brought the media storm that William had anticipated, though it unfolded differently than he had expected. The initial stories were mixed, with some outlets praising his compassion while others questioned whether he was fit to maintain royal discipline. Conservative commentators argued that he had set a dangerous precedent, that every guard would now expect special treatment when facing personal difficulties. Progressive voices celebrated what they saw as a modernization of an ancient institution, but something unexpected began to happen. Stories started emerging from other staff members, stories that had been kept quiet for years. A palace chef who had worked through her father's funeral because she couldn't get time off. A gardener who had missed his daughter's wedding because emergency leave was denied. A security officer who had been reprimanded for taking a personal phone call when his wife went into premature labor. These stories, once they began to surface, created a groundswell of public support for what William had done. People began to see the incident not as a one-time exception, but as a symptom of a larger problem. The royal household, for all its grandeur and tradition, had been operating under policies that failed to account for the very real human needs of the people who served it. William watched this unfold with a mixture of pride and concern. He was glad that the conversation had shifted toward improving working conditions, but he also worried about the pressure it was putting on the entire royal system. Change, especially in an institution as old and traditional as the British monarchy, never came easily. Catherine found him in his study one evening, reading through the latest round of articles and opinion pieces. She had become his sounding board throughout this entire experience, offering perspective when he felt overwhelmed. "You started something," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Whether you meant to or not, you've opened a door that's been locked for a very long time." "I'm not sure I'm ready to be a revolutionary," William said with a tired smile. "I just wanted to do the right thing for one person." "But that's exactly how change happens," Catherine replied. "One person, one decision, one moment of choosing compassion over convention. Now the question is, what do you do with the momentum you've created?" William had been thinking about this question constantly. The palace had assembled a committee to review staff policies and procedures, but committees moved slowly, and he worried that the energy around this issue would dissipate before any real changes were implemented. "I want to do more," he admitted, "but I'm also aware that I can't just make sweeping changes without consulting the proper channels. There's a hierarchy, a process. My father supports what I did with Thompson, but that doesn't mean he's ready to overhaul centuries of tradition." "Maybe you don't need to overhaul everything," Catherine suggested. "Maybe you just need to continue doing what you did with Thompson. Lead by example. When you see injustice or unnecessary rigidity, address it. When you make mistakes, admit them. Show people that leadership is about more than maintaining the status quo. Her words resonated with him. She was right. He couldn't single-handedly transform the entire institution overnight, but he could continue to make decisions that reflected his values and hope that over time, those decisions would influence the culture. The 2 weeks of Thompson's leave passed quickly, and soon it was time for the young guard to return to his post. William had received regular updates on Margaret Thompson's condition. She had responded well to treatment and was home recovering. The prognosis was still uncertain, but she was stable and comfortable. Surrounded by her family, on Thompson's first day back, William made a point of walking by his post in the morning. The guard stood tall and proud in his red uniform, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned. When William approached, Thompson's eyes flickered with recognition before returning to their fixed forward stare. "Welcome back, Thompson," William said quietly, just loud enough for the guard to hear. "I trust your mother is doing better." "Yes, Your Royal Highness." "Thank you, sir. Good, I'm glad you're here." William continued on his way, but he noticed something different in Thompson's bearing. There was still the same discipline, the same dedication to duty. But now there was also a sense of loyalty and gratitude that went beyond mere obligation. Thompson wasn't just following orders anymore. He was serving because he wanted to, because he believed in what the institution could be, not just what it had always been. Over the following months, the changes William had inadvertently set in motion began to take shape. The committee reviewing staff policies recommended several significant reforms. Emergency leave policies were expanded and made more flexible. A confidential support system was established where staff could report when they were facing personal crises without fear of judgment or repercussion. Training for supervisors was updated to include emotional intelligence and conflict resolution alongside traditional protocol instruction. Not everyone was happy with these changes. Some longtime staff members grumbled that standards were slipping, that the palace was becoming too soft. William heard these complaints and took them seriously, but he also saw the positive effects of the new policies. Staff morale improved. Turnover decreased. People who had once kept their personal struggles hidden now felt comfortable seeking help when they needed it. One afternoon, about 6 months after the initial incident, William was invited to attend a ceremony recognizing long-serving members of the royal household staff. Thompson was among those being honored not for his years of service, which hadn't yet reached the typical milestone, but for his exemplary conduct and his role in inspiring positive change within the NSU section. As Thompson stepped forward to receive his commendation, William saw the pride in the young man's face, but also the humility. Thompson had never sought recognition or attention. He had simply tried to do his duty while dealing with an impossible situation. And somehow that had catalyzed a transformation that benefited thousands of people who worked for the royal family. After the ceremony, Thompson approached William, his commendation medal gleaming on his chest. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted to thank you again. Not just for what you did for me and my family, but for everything that has come from it. The new policies have made a real difference for so many people." "You're the one who deserves thanks," William replied. "Your integrity and honesty, even when it was difficult, that's what made all of this possible. I just had to be wise enough to listen." Thompson shook his head slightly. "With respect, sir, you did more than listen. You admitted you were wrong. You changed course. That's rare, especially for someone in your position. It's the kind of leadership people will follow, not because they have to, but because they want to." As Thompson returned to his duties, William reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. What had started as a moment of embarrassment, a mistake made in the heat of the moment, had become one of the most significant learning experiences of his life. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about having the courage to recognize those mistakes and the humility to correct them. The embarrassment that had initially worried him had materialized, but not in the way he had feared. Yes, there had been criticism and uncomfortable scrutiny. Yes, there had been difficult conversations and challenging moments of self-reflection. But the real embarrassment had been internal. The realization that he had almost let protocol blind him to compassion, that he had nearly punished a good man for being human. That evening, William found himself once again in his study, but this time his thoughts were more settled. Catherine joined him, as she often did, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a while. "I've been thinking," William said eventually, "about what all of this means for the future. When I become king, whenever that may be, I want to be the kind of leader who remembers this lesson. I want to build an institution that honors tradition while also honoring the people who serve it." Catherine took his hand. "You will be. You already are. But remember, you don't have to wait until you're king to be that kind of leader. You're doing it now, every day, with every decision you make." She was right, of course. Leadership wasn't a title you assumed or a crown you wore. It was a choice you made again and again, in moments big and small. It was about seeing people, really seeing them, not just as servants or subjects or symbols, but as human beings with their own struggles and stories and dreams. The story of Thompson and the dismissed royal guard became something of a legend within palace circles. New staff members heard about it during their orientation, though the details sometimes got embellished in the retelling. But the core truth remained that even in an institution bound by centuries of tradition, there was still room for compassion, for growth, for change. Years later, when Thompson eventually retired from the Royal Guard after a distinguished career, he wrote a letter to William. In it, he thanked the prince not just for the mercy shown on that autumn morning, but for the example set. He wrote about how that experience had shaped his own approach to leadership within the Guard, how he had tried to balance discipline with understanding, to see his fellow guards as people rather than just soldiers. William kept that letter in his desk drawer. On difficult days when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy, he would take it out and read it. It reminded him of why he did what he did, of why the monarchy still mattered in the modern world. Not because of crowns or castles or ceremonies, but because of the opportunity to serve, to lead, to make a difference in people's lives. The incident that had started with embarrassment and ended with transformation taught William something essential about the nature of leadership and legacy. The greatest moments of growth often came from the most uncomfortable experiences. The most important changes often began with admitting you were wrong. And the strongest institutions were not those that never bent, but those that learned to flex without breaking, to honor the past while embracing the future. As William continued his journey toward eventually becoming king, he carried this lesson with him. He knew there would be more difficult decisions ahead. More moments when he would have to choose between tradition and innovation, between protocol and compassion. But he also knew that he had the wisdom to navigate those challenges, the humility to admit when he made mistakes, and the courage to correct his course when necessary. The Royal Guard continued to stand watch outside the palace, their red uniforms and bearskin hats, symbols of centuries of tradition and service. But now, behind those still faces and rigid postures, there was something more. There was the knowledge that they served an institution that valued them as individuals, that their sacrifices were recognized and appreciated, that their humanity mattered as much as their duty. And in the end, that was the true legacy of that autumn morning when Prince William dismissed a royal guard on the spot. It wasn't the embarrassment or the controversy or even the policy changes that followed. It was the reminder that even in a world of ancient protocol and rigid tradition, compassion still had the power to transform, and that the strongest leaders were those brave enough to lead with their hearts as well as their heads.